Hello, my name's Faye and today I want to talk to you about the 11 books that I read in March. I only finished one today, which is already in April, but let's just count it. 11 books. I'm going to start with what I found really quite disappointing and work my way up so that we end on a high, because I did read some excellent books in March as well. But let's kick things off with a translated book that I really didn't enjoy. I've since reading it returned it to the library. I read I Want to Die But I Want to Eat tteokbokki by Hey. And this book I saw kicking around Bookstagram especially quite a lot 1 or 2 years ago, and this is a South Korean sort of non-fiction book. The author writes about her experience in therapy, struggling with depression but also anxiety, and maybe that already head starts us into what I didn't like about the book. I actually found it very rambly, and when things deal a lot with psychological topics, I want them to be concrete. I think that is me just thinking back to my days. I did graduate in psychology. I did study psychology, and I feel like if someone is writing too much in a sort of common sense, sort of self-helpy manner, even though that may be the person's experience of going through therapy, I almost feel like it gives therapy a bad rep. I realize that I'm being very strict here on this one, but as one really didn't resonate with me. We have transcripts of her therapy sessions which read like her therapist basically just like telling her what to do, which that shouldn't be your experience of therapy really. And then sort of stacked on to the supposed end, there are sort of little snippets that read more sort of like blog entries, which read very much sort of just like sort of like pop culture rambly little blog entries of someone in their late 20s. I don't know, I really didn't understand this one. I also must admit I don't really understand the success of this book. I think there are far better, more nuanced books about the experience of going through therapy. I think maybe you should talk to someone. Is that the title? I thought that was a very good book, written by a therapist about her own experience going through psychotherapy, so far more sort of reflected and sort of self-knowledgeable, which doesn't mean you can only write a book if you have all this sort of deeper insight into how psychotherapy works, but this one I really thought like barely scratched the surface. Another book that rather disappointed me was Wolfish by Erica Berry. I listened to this on audio on my Script app, and maybe I would have preferred this if I had read it as a physical copy. This again is non-fiction. Erica Berry writes about wolves, but sort of intersperses her researching wolves with her own relationship to fear. Is that a weird way of saying that? The subscript is wolf, self, and the stories we tell about fear. And that basically already tells you what is in the book, and also that is the whole portion that I didn't like. Whenever she talked about wolves, so she talks a lot about sort of like environmentalists in the US fighting for wolves and their territory, and we follow a few sort of select wolves that get tracked with like a GPS tracker, and like all of that I thought was interesting. And then she flips back to her experience as a student and being scared to walk the street at night, and how that is also wrapped up in her identity as a woman, and how we as women are taught to fear the big bad wolf. And she kind of tries to use this metaphor from fairy tales, this big bad wolf, and how we fear what we do not know. And she just sort of gets lost a bit. I mean, the wolf as a metaphor, also for in Germany actually, it is in the media sometimes used as a metaphor also for people fearing immigrants, sort of settling or even being made to settle in a certain area. And there are a lot of parallels being drawn between sort of rural areas in Germany being afraid of wolf populations, and how we people react similarly to humans that we don't want living in our backyard, basically. And yes, that is a really crass metaphor, but it does actually work. And in Erica Berry's book, I felt like the metaphors that she is trying to use don't really work, because us being afraid of a man raping us on the street at night really isn't comparable to us being afraid of wolves repopulating certain areas that we are not used to living side by side with the animal. I don't know. I thought she just really lost herself in their argument. There are parts towards the end where she then also talks about sort of like connection and family and motherhood and the wolf, and basically she's just writing about her experience of the corona pandemic. I don't know, this one really didn't work for me. The reason why I'm so disappointed though is because I thought this would be a home run. Non-fiction paired with like a personal experience usually has a really easy time with me, and this one unfortunately I didn't love. I only gave this 4.86 out of 10 rating. Yeah, so my second to last poor rating of the month, unfortunately. Again, on script, I read Homesick by Jennifer Croft, which was long listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is the only reason that it was on my radar. This is the story of Amy and Zoe, two sisters who grow up very close. The older sister, I want to say Amy, I'm not sure if I'm confusing them now, feels very responsible for her younger daughter, who has quite a lot of medical procedures that she undergoes, and also the older daughter is very, very intelligent, as in genius level, enters college with a scholarship at age 16. And the interesting aspect of this story, I guess, is that it is told in short little vignettes. Every chapter is only sort of 2 pages long, sometimes shorter. And the author has worked as or currently does still work as a translator. So we also have this personal relationship of the character Amy to languages, learning languages. In her case, she learns Russian as a child because of a sort of personal infatuation with a figure skater. And almost as a sort of side comment, quite traumatic things happen in their lives. And I really felt like the style of the book kept me at a distance. These short little snippets really stopped me from getting invested in this story of a young girl. I used to really like stories told from the point of view as children or teenagers, and more often I feel either like the book is somewhat immature, which is fair enough, but that's just not something that I currently enjoy reading, or it's written in a too sort of precocious adult way, and then I feel like that doesn't match the character. The voice of this character shouldn't read like an adult. And towards the end of the book, she sort of suddenly is an adult, and we have a few pages where she sort of travels around the world, and I felt like that would have been the story that would have interested me more, and I actually felt like the voice fit that age better as well. So again, somehow this just didn't work for me stylistically. Not awful, but also, if I'm honest, not a book that I will be recommending to many people. Next, as a digital copy from the library, I read The Heart Principle by Helen Huang, which is a romance book, the third book in a sort of series, but with characters that don't meet, aren't related very much. So you can read this as a standalone. We follow our main character, who is a violinist, I believe. Oh God, this is already proof for me sort of finding this romance book very middle of the road. She has player's block. She's a professional violinist and finds herself getting obsessed with the mistakes that she's making when rehearsing a piece of music. So she starts over and over and over. And within the book, I feel like this isn't too much of a spoiler because Helen Huang has the previous two books that she wrote, The Kiss Quotient and The Bride. No, title's gone. Two previous romance novels of hers that I quite liked reading, actually, center around female adults that are diagnosed with autism, as is the case for our violinist in this story. Oh yeah, Anna, she's called, I think. Anna Sun, maybe. And this reads as quite an interesting book about the experience of getting a diagnosis like that quite late on in life. And I thought that was interesting, but I thought the love story was real boring. Just really, really boring. I'm struggling to remember how they even met, even though I only read this like 3 weeks ago. He is way too good to be true. He basically just sort of sticks around for it all and feeds her and takes care of her and is patient with her when her family is elitist and dickish. So not a bad one, but also there are more fun romance books that you can read when you feel like it. But it was the very first book that I ever read on the Libby app, the library digital books app, basically. And that was amazing. This is just so cool. So many books at my fingertips. So, it gets maybe like a little half point for that, just for that being a cool experience. Next, I want to talk about American Gods, which I'm counting for March, but I did finish it in April. I read the bulk of this in March. This is the story of all the gods battling to stay relevant and maintain power in the USA. Neil Gaiman is a British author, I believe, so that was kind of fun. He writes about basically immigrants, expats, bringing the myths and tales and stories and beliefs in their gods to the USA, and then the belief in these gods dwindling away. And our protagonist, Shadow, is sought out by a god and basically hired as his assistant. The beginning of the book, Shadow is days away from being released from prison from an offence that we learn about later on. He's been in prison for 3 years. He's a big, tough-looking guy, quiet guy though. Not quick to pick a fight, but when all his options kind of run out, he starts working as an assistant for this god in this war of old and new gods. The idea behind this, I think, is really, really good. Also, this is the cover that goes along with the TV series that they made that I haven't seen yet, but I will check out now. But I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. The first few pages in, I thought were so funny and inventive, and the characters were like cool and quirky. I could see them before my inner eye. And then, unfortunately, I thought back to The Sandman, which is, again, a Neil Gaiman story that I didn't read, but I did watch the Netflix series. And I feel like he has a similar way of telling a story. He comes up with unique characters. He spends a lot of time explaining what they look like. But I lacked quite a lot of the internal life of these characters. I got a bit bored with all the women being beautiful and alluring in their own way, and only sort of being important for the male's quest. I don't know, maybe I'm being really nitpicky here. This is not criticism that I've heard very much going around when it comes to American Gods, so maybe this is just me. But that bugged me a bit. Also, it's really long. This is like a longer version or edition that Neil Gaiman wanted to write, and so they reissued it and gave him sort of free reign. So this is even longer, I believe, than the initial published American Gods. And there's a lot of filler. I mean, you do get anecdotes about all these different kind of gods that did make me like Google names and figure out like what the myth is that this is based on, and all that is fun. And if you maybe like geeking out about that topic, sort of like if like myths and gods and retellings are like your thing, then maybe you will like this more than I did. For me, this was only like a middle of the road 3.5 stars book, to be honest. The same rating I am also giving a very different book, which is Ghost Music by An Yu. This is a fiction novel by a Chinese author who writes in English though. It was set in Beijing. We follow our main character, who is a piano teacher. She always wanted to be a pianist, but you know, those that can't do teach. And her mother-in-law moves in with her and her husband, and that sort of like kickstarts problems in their relationship, unspoken secrets that they maybe should have talked about. And as this cover suggests, there's this whole storyline of baskets of mushrooms turning up at their doorstep, and her mother-in-law initially bond over these mushrooms because they are from an region in China where the mother-in-law is from, and she teaches her how to prepare and cook these mushrooms. But then mushrooms start popping up elsewhere, maybe in dreams, maybe guiding her. This starts getting very sort of surreal and fantastical. It's not a very long book, and at first I thought it was really quite inventive how this idea of magical realism was supporting this, telling the story of this woman, 30-ish, really upset and lost in life, discontent with her relationship, but then in the end it didn't really work for me. I don't know, it started getting a bit too weird, and lost me in its symbolism. So I think this would be a fun read for people who are just like, I mean, this is like super niche, right? But if you like reading about classical music and mushrooms, and I feel like there are readers out there, you know, with like the whole sort of like mushroom, like spora, mushroom horror subgenre. This is like very niche, but I think there is a reader out there who would love this. It wasn't me, I only thought it was. Okay. Now we're slowly getting better and better. Snowflake by Louise Naylan is an Irish novel about Debbie, who starts university, her first year at Trinity College in Dublin. She's very much like a country bumpkin, and we read about her struggle to sort of fit in with Dublin city university life, with like this glamorous new friend that she makes, and her home life with a quite troubled mother, and her uncle who's always lived behind the house in a sort of camper van thing, and she's just mature beyond her age because she's always had to fulfill quite an adult role in her mother's life growing up, but she is also very young in other ways in this university environment. I liked the dynamics of the relationships between these characters, very much a character, not plot centered story. Some really sad things happen almost quickly and in passing, so you may want to check for trigger warnings actually, even though I thought on the forefront this was a light-hearted story. It does cover some serious topics. I feel like maybe I would have liked this a little more a few years ago, a bit closer to my own university experience. This way, looking on it, I found myself almost feeling a little condescending or cynic as a reader, which is not a nice experience. Almost looking down on this sort of 20-year-old, sort of thinking like, oh bless, yes, I do realize you think this is the most important thing ever right now, that you didn't get an A in an exam, but perspective, honey, perspective. Yeah, so I didn't like myself reading this book that much, which I think is influencing my rating of this book. If you like a sort of coming of age story, then I think Snowflake could be a great one. Also, it was March, the Irish Readathon was going on, so I was eager to read a book by an Irish author, and I had this one on my shelf. This was like, yeah, this was like good. This was like a strong 3 stars, maybe even 4, if I'm being kind. Then I read a translated book by an Egyptian author because I spent a week on holiday in Egypt with my boyfriend. I read Woman at Point Zero by Nawal El-Saadawi. Not a light beach read. This is the story of Firdaus, a woman awaiting her death sentence in prison. And our unnamed narrator, heavily inspired by the author herself, interviews this inmate. And she talks about her life growing up, first sort of in the country, somewhere rural. I think she doesn't really name how she grows up. Very poor circumstances, and how she then ends up in Cairo. Her life leads into prostitution and anger. And not an easy read, but as my research told me and how I ended up picking this book as well, very much a important, almost like modern classic feminist voice. I also really appreciated reading a feminist viewpoint that wasn't with a Western gaze. This was first published in 1975 in Arabic. So I do think I'm somewhat attempting to broaden my horizon by not just reading American, British and German voices on feminism. And even though this is dated, scary how relevant the experience of women is. It's not very long. I do actually strongly recommend this to anyone who feels like they can stomach some heavy stuff. I'm really glad that I read it. Yeah, Woman at Point Zero. It is fiction, but heavily influenced by the author's own experience being incarcerated for a short while, and working as a psychiatrist, I believe, interviewing women when she was sort of researching neurosis in female inmates. So she does know what she's talking about. Yes, highly influenced by own experience, I would say. Now we're up to the 3 favourite books that I read in March. I read Jen Bain's Big Swiss as part of an online book club and thought it was so funny. I don't really like humorous books, but this is the story of Greta, is that her name? Yes. Greta, who works as a transcriptionist for a relationship therapist, guru, who aptly calls himself and that already shows sort of how tongue-in-cheek a lot of the commentary is. Greta, falls in love with one of the female clients of this guy by only listening to the transcripts. And things go from there. I don't actually want to tell you more about it because I will spoil too much. There are 2 dogs in the story. I can tell you that. And Greta's also just sort of like a bit lost in life as well. She's a little older, not old, but like older than the typical like 30-year-old lost in life that I gravitate towards. I feel like she's probably sort of like in her mid-40s, so I have a lot to look forward to. Maybe I will just spend the next decade ambling around unsure about my work and personal life. Big Swiss has some really funny quotes though, and maybe I'll read you one because it'll give you a taste for whether you or not you find this funny, because humor is personal, right? Yes. A quote from page 187 is, "Why was she obsessed with this person? She was humorless. It was like having an affair with Kierkegaard or B.F. Skinner." I just think it's just so good. I really just think it's so good. One more, and then I'll just scratch that because I can't really tell you much more about the story without spoiling it. The ending is a bit loveless. I really would have liked a little bit more stern talking to by the editor, because the ending could have been changed and could have been much stronger. But one more quote so you can decide whether you want to read Big Swiss by Jen Begging. "She'd been smoking her feelings since she was 15, and now, at age 33, her real self was beginning to emerge. Unfortunately, her real self was horny, easily enraged, and no longer interested in making money." So good. It's a really fun book. I really enjoyed it. I laughed a few times. I rarely laugh when reading. And I think this is just a really great new book, buzzy book out there. Read it, enjoy it. I think quite a few people will still be reading this one. Then I finished The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which I won't talk about at length because I've talked about it before. This is a fantasy novel, the first in maybe a duology. I'm not actually sure if it's going to be more than 2 books. Set in New York City, in which the different boroughs create their own avatars, birth new avatars that fight for the boroughs. The different people portrayed in this that fight for, Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, they are really, really like stereotypical characters, which has been the main criticism that I've seen kicking around by this one. But I thought that in itself was clever, because we do stereotype cities and areas of cities. I thought this was a really fun, sort of plotty book, which reads a lot like a road trip book. It's all set in New York City, but as we sort of chase from one scene to the next, it feels a lot like a sort of road trip vibe would feel like. I thought it was really fun. I think N.K. Jemisin's writing is something that you kind of have to get into. Like, quite often, sort of the first few pages, you're like, not sure what's going on. But then you sort of surrender a little to her magical system and her rules. And then it's just really, really fun. I believe she extended a short story that she wrote years and years ago to come up with this story. So many people have said it reads like a love story to New York City, and I would agree. I went to New York once, a very long time ago, and still I felt like this was fun. But we have so many pictures in our head of New York City already, so I think even someone who's not been there would enjoy this. I also think it's a really fun exercise to think about what the avatar of the place that you live in would look like. I mean, obviously you're kind of tempted into thinking in prototypes, stereotypes, maybe in prejudices. But I feel like this is done in good spirit, and also by an author who I trust not to be, I don't know, well, tasteless or discriminating with it. So I think she was the perfect author to write this book. I had a really good time reading it. And then my highest rating is the shortest book I read in March, which is Foster by Claire Keegan. I read Small Things Like These towards the end of last year by Claire Keegan and also liked it. This one I loved even a little bit more because the story, I think, is a sweeter one. We follow, sorry, I have to release my dog here. Hey, you're lovely, not ya? We follow the story of a young girl who's growing up in a poor family in Ireland. I'm not sure if the setting, the time period is named, actually. I'm not sure. I sort of feel like 50s, 60s, but don't actually know whether that's true. Maybe it's way later. And she goes to spend time with her aunt and her husband as a foster, basically because her mum is expecting yet another child and they have too many mouths to feed. And this is really just the story of her getting to know her aunt and her uncle and building a relationship with them and feeling cared for and at home in a way that she's never felt like in her family home. So I thought this was actually a very powerful short story for found families, as opposed to the ones that you're just sort of like stuck with by birthright. I thought the relationship, especially between her and her uncle, was a really nice one. And what I liked about this compared to some other, sort of like unhappy, mistreated children's stories, was that this doesn't actually beat down on her biological parents. I mean, emotionally, this did quite a lot with me and I was angry with them, but the focus is the foster family. So not the sad, difficult background, but the promise and the beautiful life that is very much possible with every new relationship that you form. So I thought this was such a sweet and tender story. It's a very quick read. My edition is under 100 pages, but very powerful despite the lightness, hefty despite its lightness. Very, very strong recommendation. Claire Keegan is also an Irish author, so there was a little nod to Irishness, it being March again. So ending with the high, I did read some great books, I read some disappointing books. Let me know what your March was like and I'll see you very, very soon. Let's chat about books down below. Bye bye.